This video is for educational and infotainment purposes only. It is not intended to encourage or glorify the use of drugs, violence, or criminal activity in any way. So Carlos Lehder, one of the main guys in charge of getting Pablo Escobar's cocaine from Colombia into the United States, had a problem. The smaller planes that he had been using to avoid radar detection didn't hold enough fuel to make the entire trip from Colombia to the United States. And stopping in the Bahamas to refuel with a plane full of cocaine was risky business. So what did Carlos do to make sure that all of that cocaine remained safe? Well, you're about to find out. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching Lawyer Up. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the life and times of Carlos Crazy Charlie Lehder, former drug lord, master smuggler, party boy, and the co-founder of the Medellin drug cartel. Now, of course, we are going to talk about the drug smuggling that he did with George Jung. But we're also going to talk about the economics of cocaine and exactly how Carlos became a billionaire in a few short years. Then we're going to talk about how it all came crashing down after his own cartel turned on him and led authorities directly to him. Finally, we're going to talk about where he is today, because despite being sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 135 years, he ain't in prison. If you enjoy the episode, do me a favor, hit that like button for me. If you got something to say, you got a question or a comment, put it in the comment sections below. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. And you guys know it, that I love it when you share me on social media. Now, most of what we know about Carlos Lehder's life comes from his smuggling partner, George Jung's own memoirs that he wrote while sitting in a prison cell. That was ultimately the basis of the movie Blow, released in 2001, starring Johnny Depp. Other information was gained in connection with Lehder's cooperation with the U.S. authorities and his testimony in court against Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega. But the story starts when Carlos Enrique Lehder was born in 1949 in Colombia, South America. His father, Klaus Wilhelm Lehder, was actually a German engineer who had immigrated to Colombia for work because he had a skill that almost no one else in Colombia had. He knew how to design and build buildings with this brand new thing in them called an elevator. So he was widely sought after in multi-level building construction projects. While there, his father married a Colombian woman, Helena Rivas, the daughter of a local jeweler, and they had 4 kids, with Carlos being the third. Carlos grew up in Armenia, Colombia, a city outside of Medellin. In addition to engineering tasks, the family owned a small inn called Pensión Alemana, where German immigrants would regularly meet. Now, this inn was otherwise unremarkable, other than in 1943, intelligence reports from the United States claimed that it was a location where the Lehders, along with several other Germans in Colombia, were gathering to share Nazi intelligence. And while nothing formally came of those accusations that they were Nazi sympathizers, Klaus would ultimately change his first name to the more locally familiar Guillermo. Now, Carlos was never really much for book learning. School was not for him. So he began getting involved in the criminal element in Medellin. And those of you that know your history know that the criminal element in Medellin would soon be assembling under the direction of one Pablo Escobar into one of the most powerful criminal enterprises to ever exist on planet Earth. But that's a bit later. So Carlos would live in Colombia until his parents divorced when he was 15 years old, after which he immigrated with his mother to New York in the United States. Now, while in New York, he continued in his criminal endeavors, being involved in a small-time car theft ring wherein he would steal cars in the U.S., drive them to Canada for shipment back down to Colombia to be sold by his family. It was during this time that Carlos fell in love with two things: John Lennon and the soft drink Coca-Cola. He actually became known for stealing cars and then blaring Beatles music and drinking a Coke as he drove them to Canada for shipment. He would later state that he hated everything about the United States except for Coca-Cola. Carlos continued in this line of work until he was busted for grand theft auto and smuggling stolen cars and was sentenced to the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, where he met his new cellmate, a guy by the name of George Jung. So let's switch gears for a minute and talk about his new cellmate, Boston George. George Jacob Jung was born in 1942 in Weymouth, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. After graduating high school in 1961, Jung briefly attended college where he studied marketing before dropping out. It was during college that Jung began partying, recreationally using marijuana, and where he witnessed firsthand the tremendous demand for pot. And that got the wheels spinning in his head. So it's 1967, and after returning home for a stint, George and a childhood buddy he called Tuna took off for Long Beach, California. It was there that they saw the hippie movement in full swing and really a much larger supply of marijuana than they had back home. And it was then that they immediately realized the enormous profit potential in smuggling cannabis from California back to New England. And as luck would have it, Jung had a girlfriend who was a stewardess who routinely flew cross-country. So initially, Jung had his girlfriend transport the drugs in her suitcase on flights. But the frequency and quantity was just not near enough to meet demand. So in search of greater profits, Jung expanded his operation to flying drugs in from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, using his own private pilots and airplanes that they either rented or sometimes borrowed without permission. It was during this time that Jung actually taught himself to fly by meticulously watching and learning from professional pilots he had hired to fly his dope. So after a while, he is flying his own planes and business was booming. Now it's 1974, the height of his marijuana enterprise, and Jung and his associates are reportedly making $250,000 a month. That would be the equivalent of $1.7 million in today's dollars. So needless to say, Boston George, as he was now being called, had become very popular in certain circles, including being a member of Hugh Hefner's original Playboy Club in Chicago. These clubs were well known for supplying its members with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But in 1974, the Fed started cracking down. First, Hef's right-hand woman, Barbie Arnstein, was arrested and charged in federal court with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Her boyfriend was arrested next, and then it was Jung's turn. Boston George, who had actually been staying at the Playboy Club at the time, was sitting in his vehicle waiting to meet his marijuana distributor in Chicago when the feds rolled up and arrested him sitting on 660 pounds of marijuana. Busted. So from there, Jung was indicted, found guilty of trafficking marijuana, and sentenced in a famous courtroom sequence where Jung argued with the judge about the purpose of sending a man to prison for, quote, crossing an imaginary line with a bunch of plants, end quote. The judge was not impressed, and Jung was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. So it's 1975, and George Jung is introduced to his new cellie, Carlos Lehder. and little did either of them know their lives were about to change forever. Now, while these two are becoming acquainted, there are two very important things going on in the outside world. Number one, there is a group of guys in Medellin, Colombia, led by one Pablo Escobar, that was gaining a stranglehold over the world's cocaine supply. And number two, there was a huge demand growing in the United States for that white magic powder. And so you have two men sitting in a jail cell together, one from Medellin, where most of the world's coke was coming from, and the other a master smuggler from the United States. And as Jung would later recount, the men spent countless hours learning from each other. Jung learning about the growing of the coca plant and the harvesting and production of cocaine, and Lehder learning about the art of smuggling dope by aircraft into the U.S. Specifically, Jung's experience flying marijuana into the United States from Mexico in small aircraft, staying below radar level and landing on dry lake beds or abandoned runways. So before long, they had hatched the obvious plan to smuggle Medellin cocaine into the United States by way of airplane. And then they turned their attention to the various ways that they would launder the money they earned in doing so, because it was going to be a lot of money. So let's put this all into some perspective. On the supply side, they still say that over half of the world's cocaine comes from Colombia. And back in its heyday, 80% of the world's cocaine coming into the United States was controlled, at least in part, by the Medellin cartel. And as for the U.S., cocaine was popular at the turn of the 20th century until 1914, when it was criminalized due to its high potential for addiction and abuse. From there, cocaine was really dormant in the U.S. until the 60s, when the hippies came along. Now, no, the hippies were not doing cocaine. They preferred marijuana and psychedelics, but they normalized drug experimentation and the recreational drug use in the United States. So it was the next generation that adopted cocaine as its drug of choice, fueling the sex, drugs, and rock and roll mantra of the 70s and 80s. So you had Pablo Escobar with most of the world's cocaine supply and an entire generation of Americans wanting a piece of it. That is the recipe for success. Now let's take a look at the economics of this. So cocaine values vary drastically around the globe, and of course, as with all products, they change with time. But fundamentally, the bottom line has always remained true. A kilo of powder cocaine goes for a few $1,000s in Colombia. If you smuggle that same kilo of powder cocaine to the US, it is worth anywhere from 5 to 10 times as much. And if you're willing to bust it up and sell it by the gram on the streets, you can make even more money. So let's say cocaine is selling on average for $100 a gram on the streets in the United States. So with a kilo, that's 1,000 grams of coke. At $100 a gram, that's $100,000. So as a business model, if you can take something worth a few $1,000s in place A, Colombia, and take it to place B, the United States, where it is worth 10 times its original value, you are going to do that as many times as you can. And like I said, if you bust it up, you can turn it into a hell of a lot more money. And that, my friends, is the recipe for the creation of a billionaire. There is a lot of money at stake, which is why people are willing to kill and be killed over it. So, beginning in about 1975, Pablo Escobar had perfected his cocaine production, and he was working on his distribution operation. He was mainly using drug couriers who would carry drugs on or in their body and suitcases in a process that was the brainchild of Griselda Blanco. The problem was that the quantity was just too small. But help was on the way, because soon both George Jung and Carlos Lehder would be released from prison. Time for a quick break. As most of you know, Lawyer Up has partnered with Webull, the online broker that allows you to buy or sell stocks or crypto or whatever you are into directly from your computer or the mobile app on your phone. Webull is free to join, it's free to use, there is no cost to buy or sell, so it's commission-free trading. Better yet, when you sign up and you link your bank account and deposit as little as 1 penny, Webull will give you at least 2 free stocks worth at least $3 per share. So it is free money as well. So if you would like to join the over 2 million Webull traders, all you have to do is click on the description below this video and sign up. Happy trading. So it's 1976 and both George Jung and Carlos Lehder are released from prison, and it's go time. First, the two built up a small revenue stream from simple traditional drug smuggling. Specifically, they enlisted 2 young women who were U.S. citizens to take a vacation in Antigua, receive cocaine, and carry it back with them to the United States in their suitcases. Repeating this process several times, Lehder and Jung soon had enough money to buy an airplane. Next, the pair begins to fly cocaine into the U.S., and in the process, they increased their financial resources and they were building connections and trust with the Colombian suppliers. So as their then unconventional method of drug smuggling began to gain credibility, Lehder gets he and Jung a meeting with Pablo Escobar, and they lay out the details of their plans to smuggle lots and lots of cocaine into the U.S. via airplane. Pablo liked the idea and basically turned the portion of his smuggling operation that moved cocaine into Florida over to Carlos Lehder and some American that they referred to as El Americano. And it was from there that they would smuggle huge quantities of cocaine into the US and make hundreds of millions of dollars. As they made more money, they bought more planes and bigger planes to smuggle in more cocaine to make even more money. But the problem was that the planes really couldn't make the entire trip from South America to Florida without stopping and refueling in the Bahamas. And loaded down with cocaine, that was risky. So, in 1978, Carlos Lehder just purchased his own damn island. Lehder transformed Norman's Cay, an island in the Bahamas about 200 miles southeast of Florida, into the transshipment point for Medellin cartel cocaine, headed for Florida and the southeastern United States. Initially, Norman's Cay consisted of a marina, a yacht club, approximately 100 private homes, and an airstrip. Carlos would quickly add a huge refrigerated warehouse to store the cocaine. Lehder also expanded the runway to 1,000 meters so that really big planes loaded with tons of coke could land there. Now, as I mentioned, there were other residents originally on the island. But over time, Lehder either bought them out or bullied them out and eventually had sole control of the entire island. From there, he would protect the island with radar surveillance, bodyguards, and Doberman attack dogs, and Lehder began spreading the money around amongst the Bahamian government officials for both political and judicial protection. So from 1978 to 1982, Norman's Cay was the Caribbean's main drug smuggling hub and a tropical hideaway and playground for Lehder and his associates. He had the local officials bought off with bribes and really had no worries as he threw massive cocaine-fueled parties on the island and moved hundreds of tons of cocaine with George Jung. So how specifically were they able to smuggle the drugs into the U.S.? Well, mostly by air, but also by land and sea. In the beginning, they would just fly in smaller planes loaded down with cocaine from the Bahamas to Miami. They flew mostly at night. The more success they had, the larger the planes became. And once the runway was expanded, they could fly in cocaine from Colombia in a much larger aircraft that was able to land fully loaded on the expanded airstrip. So the routine was that on Friday night, an airplane from Norman's Cay would fly to Escobar's ranch in Colombia. They would load it with cocaine, and on Saturday, it would fly back to Norman's Cay. From there, it was reloaded into various smaller aircraft that could be flown in under radar traffic. So on Sunday afternoon, the planes would exit the Bahamas in the sea of other plane traffic headed to the United States from the Caribbean, and then they would slip under the radar as they approached the coastline. Now, once the U.S. authorities started catching on and the landing areas became hotspots, They started doing airdrops in the ocean and doing boat-to-boat transfers way out at sea to bring the cocaine in by water. They also used commercial fishing operations where it was normal to leave every day, go way out to sea, and then to come back. They used these operations to smuggle the coke in by water. They also started doing land drops. So if on the way in you learn that a landing area is hot, you can just drop the crate of cocaine in a deserted area where it can be picked up by the associates on this side of the border. So then if the plane lands and the authorities search it, it's clean. And they made hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, at one point, Carlos Lehder would have over $1 billion. Now, it would all later be seized by the government, but at one point he was a very rich man. And life was good until it wasn't. So somewhere during this time period, the Lehder-Jung partnership began to sour, due in part to a combination of Lehder's megalomania and his obsession to transform his Bahamian island into an all-purpose headquarters for operations. Lehder's operation had grown to the point that he really no longer needed El Americano to help him smuggle cocaine into the United States. Boston George was making about $15 million per run, and so cutting him out of the equation made perfect sense for Carlos. So that's what he did. As Norman's Cay became his own lawless private fiefdom, he forced Jung out of the operation, worked directly with Richard Barley, who was Jung's stateside distributor, and joined forces with international criminal financier Robert Vesco to expand his empire even more. Once they split up, Jung was still able to use his prior connections to make a more modest living at smuggling Colombian cocaine. And he basically stayed out of Lehder's way because, in Jung's own words, he was acting crazy. Hence the name Crazy Charlie. And it's also important to remember what was going on in Mexico between 1978 and 1982. After Pedro Aviles Perez, Don Pedro, who is considered the father of Mexican drug trafficking, was killed, and that is another great story available for you to check out on this channel. After that time, Felix Gallardo, Don Neto, and Rafael Caro Quintero, Rafa, would form the core of what became known as the Guadalajara cartel. And they took slinging dope to the next level. They started producing high-quality seedless marijuana, sinsemilla, in mass quantities in large multi-acre fields. They also started working with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel in assisting with trafficking even more cocaine into the United States across the border, mostly in the western U.S. It was also during this time that another drug cartel was rising to prominence in Chihuahua, just across the border from El Paso. The Juarez cartel had grown into a big boy in the narco world, and it had a major advantage as it was right on the U.S. border. This was the perfect staging area to bounce cocaine into the United States, and it would take a decade, but it's from here that Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, would yet again revolutionize drug smuggling by airplane, by not flying small planes under the radar, but by flying huge passenger jets loaded with cocaine over the radar. And you can check out his story also on this channel. So even though they had split up, there was lots of work to still be had for both George Jung and Carlos Lehder. But it wouldn't last. Lehder's initial downfall was caused by the attention his activities on Norman's Cay was attracting. After a September 1983 news report on NBC made public his blatant bribing of some Bahamian officials and his drug activities on the island, the government was forced to act. So it froze all of his bank accounts, took over his property and possessions, and issued a warrant for his arrest. So, forced to end his operations there, he returned to his hometown of Armenia, Colombia, where he built an estate. Lehder would create his own German-themed resort he called Posada Alemana. This resort featured Lehder's iconic statue of John Lennon in the buff, holding his trademark Rickenbacker guitar while wearing a Nazi war helmet and the word pa, which is Spanish for peace, is on his left arm. And the icing on the weird cake is that this statue, which was erected several years after Lenin was shot and killed, had a large hole in its chest. An odd tribute indeed. Lehder was also involved in other activities in Colombia, which to fully understand, you have to appreciate what was going on politically in both the United States and Colombia at the time. So backtracking back to 1970, the United States passed the Controlled Substances Act, and the act introduced massive penalties for trafficking drugs. The penalty for moving the volume of cocaine that the Colombian drug cartels were moving would almost certainly be a life sentence. And it was no secret that the U.S. government was after the Medellin and other Colombian drug cartels for their importation of cocaine into the United States. Talking about Colombia itself, the national government was also after the drug cartels. But the local cops, they were pretty much bought and paid for by the cartels. And so there was really no local law enforcement to police these entities. That led to a lot of lawlessness on the local level. So what happened is that local citizens began to form vigilante groups that would take action against these drug cartels. Now, obviously, they didn't have the firepower to attack them head on, so they began to kidnap family members of cartel leaders and then try to ransom them back to the drug cartels. This happened with a member of the Ochoa family as well as Carlos Lehder himself, who was actually kidnapped for a short spell in November of 1981 by a group referred to as M19. He managed to escape, but he was shot in the leg in the process. So, in response to these vigilante groups, the Colombian drug cartels created their own muscle. In particular, the Medellin cartel formed Muerte y Secuestradores, MAS, which translates in English to literally death to kidnappers. MAS was a paramilitary group whose focus was to retaliate against M19 and other guerrilla warfare groups that had sprung up in opposition to the drug cartels in Colombia. And you can't really say that this was the origin of drug cartels forming hit squads or the enforcement squads that you see prevalent in the cartel world today, but it was certainly a sign of what was to come. And having been kidnapped himself, obviously Carlos Lehder was very interested and took a leadership role in MAS. So along with everything else that was going on, Crazy Charlie was wrapped up in playing vigilante army man with this group, which was causing heartburn for many of the leaders of the drug cartel. So to summarize, you had the feds in both the United States and Colombia after cartel members. You had cartels squabbling amongst themselves, of course, including the Medellin and Cali cartels. And then you had vigilante groups that were trying to kidnap cartel members, all the while MAS is fighting back. So it's no wonder that Colombia became the murder capital of the world during this time period. But let's get back to cocaine. At the height of Lehder's operation, his wealth mounted into the billions. He accumulated such staggering wealth that on 2 occasions he offered to pay the Colombian national debt on the condition that the president agree not to extradite him to the U.S. Because remember, the Controlled Substances Act meant an almost assured life sentence. Well, his offer was rejected, but undeterred, Lehder took action to have the country's extradition laws changed from within by the legislature as both he and Pablo Escobar got into politics. Lehder founded the National Latino Movement, a neo-Nazi group which popularized itself by making speeches against extradition and who ultimately managed to gain 3 congressional seats for a short period of time. Lehder's biggest political opponent was Rodrigo Lara, the Colombian Minister of Justice, who spoke out and campaigned against the cartel and their activities. This was until April 30th of 1984, when Lara was assassinated by cartel operatives. This was not smart. The murder would mark a change in Colombian politics. After Lara's death, the president of Colombia, who had previously opposed extraditing any Colombian drug lord to the United States, announced that he was now willing to extradite. And Carlos Lehder was a leading individual on the crackdown list. Although Carlos Lehder was considered a founding member, it is widely accepted that the fellow leaders of the Medellin cartel wanted him out of the picture due to his radical behavior, which they believed would jeopardize their cocaine empire. And it wasn't just his party boy antics. His involvement in politics and MAS and the assassination of Lara all got to be a bit much for the cartel brass to stomach. So after Lehder killed one of Escobar's men at a party over a prostitute, enough was enough, and he was sent to a ranch to hide out, after which time someone informed the Colombian National Police of his location and he was arrested. And it is widely rumored that it was Escobar himself who provided Lehder's whereabouts to the police, leading to his capture on February 4th of 1987. From there, Lehder was extradited to the United States. And this was a big deal in the U.S. because remember that in 1985, the Guadalajara cartel and others had kidnapped and murdered U.S. DEA agent Kiki Camarena in Mexico. So the battle between the DEA and the narcos of the world had become personal. And Kiki's story is another great video on this channel and one that plays out in the Netflix series Narcos Mexico. So having captured one of the Medellin cartel's most powerful members, the U.S. government then used him as a source of information regarding the details of Pablo's secret empire, which later proved useful in assisting the Colombian government and others to dismantle the cartel. Lehder would stand trial in October of 1987 in Jacksonville, Florida, on charges of conspiracy to distribute cocaine and the running of a criminal enterprise. The lengthy trial continued until May of 1988, when he was convicted on all counts. He was later sentenced to life without parole, plus an additional 135 years in prison. Yowzers. And while all of this was going on, George Jung, remember him? He gets arrested with almost a ton of cocaine, literally 1,754 pounds of the stuff. And the U.S. government immediately requested his assistance in gaining information on his former partner, Carlos Lehder. Well, even though Jung wasn't too fond of Lehder, he initially declined to cooperate, fearing retribution from Pablo Escobar. However, Escobar didn't like Lehder none too much either, because remember, he had ratted out the details of their cocaine operation. So ultimately, Pablo gave Jung his blessing to cooperate with the feds. Ultimately, Jung would plead guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy and receive a 70-year prison sentence. But his sentence was reduced to 20 years after he provided information against his ex-partner, Carlos Lehder. From there, Jung served his time and was released on June 2nd of 2014 after nearly 20 years in the Bureau of Prisons. He would remarry, patch things up with his daughter Christina, and they even launched a business together in 2016, BG Apparel and Merchandise. BG standing for Boston George, and they had the slogan, quote, "I can't sell dope anymore, so now I sell dope clothing." End quote. As for Lehder, even though sentenced to life plus 135 years, he would testify against Panamanian President Manuel Noriega, saying that Noriega had allowed Panama to be used as a transshipment conduit for the cartel's cocaine smuggling operations. In return, Lehder's sentence was reduced to 55 years in 1992. Now that's officially what happened, but it's not what Carlos Lehder thought was going to happen. Because beginning in 2005, Lehder made pleas to various government entities in the U.S. and Colombia, saying that he was entitled to be released under the Noriega cooperation agreement he had made back in 1991. His complaints included various court filings and arguments, including one letter to a judge that the judge found threatening. In the end, Carlos Lehder would remain in prison until 2020. He was then deported from the U.S. to Germany, where he still held citizenship through his father. And although suffering from cancer, he is actually out of prison and a free man today. And according to his lawyer, he presently lives in Germany. His partner, George Jung, would die on May 5th of 2021 at his Weymouth, Massachusetts home from liver and kidney failure. And of course, Pablo Escobar would be killed in a shootout with authorities in 1993. But in the end, who else other than Carlos Lehder could be sentenced to life plus 135 and yet be a free man today? So that's the episode on Crazy Charlie Lehder. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button for me. If you haven't subscribed, smash the subscribe button for me right now. If you got something to say, put it in the comment sections below. And if you're interested in learning more about basically anybody I talked about in today's video, George Jung, Pablo Escobar, Kiki Camarena, whoever, we've got a narco video dedicated to them on this channel. That is all for today. My name is Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.